Lesson 29, long exposure photography. Using slower than normal shutter speeds can be a lot of fun. When you choose a slow shutter speed, like making a long exposure, you can create photos that we can never naturally see with our eyes. The duration that a camera's shutter can remain open is a lot different than the way our eyes function, so we can create some really interesting images by utilizing this aspect of photography. And as with making any photo, the key is balancing the shutter speed, so even if it's a very long exposure, with your aperture and your ISO setting, so you're letting the right amount of light in to affect the sensor and create the image. You can take photos of any subject you like using a long exposure, even ones that don't appear to be moving, and over time, over a long exposure time, you can create images that look different than what you actually saw. So think of a pond on a still evening. It's going to appear to be very flat and still, but there will be some amount of movement, or clouds moving slowly in the sky. If these are exposed for long enough, they'll create some very interesting effects. Low light situations are the easiest to make long exposure photography. When there's a lot of light, it can be really difficult to set a very slow shutter speed because you can't manage to get the ISO low enough or the aperture narrow enough to balance with a very slow shutter speed. So low light situations make it much easier. And using a good sturdy tripod makes long exposure photography much easier and much more fun. You can use a lightweight tripod or rest your camera on a firm surface, but you always run the risk of getting some camera movement if you're not using a really good sturdy tripod. And any amount of camera movement can ruin a long exposure unless that camera movement is intentional. There's a few other helpful accessories for long exposure photography. A cable release is one. This is a cable that plugs into your camera that helps you avoid any camera movement when the shutter is pressed because you're using the cable rather than touching the camera. Many cameras also come with apps that you can control the time the shutter is triggered from your mobile phone. And you can also use the self-timer device on your camera. If you set it to self-timer, push the button, and then as your hands are away from the camera, it will take the photos. The longest shutter speed time on most cameras is around 30 seconds. Some cameras it can be longer, but most cameras also have a bulb setting. This allows you to have the shutter open for as long as you want it to. This one is definitely best used with either a cable release or with an app, because with these you can lock the shutter to stay open for as long as you need it to be. Your choice of subject and the amount of ambient light will determine the effect of your long exposure photography. If you're photographing a subject that's only moving very slightly, you'll need to choose a much longer exposure time to capture the effect of any movement. And if you use a very long exposure to photograph fast-moving subjects, they might be a complete blur, or you may not even be able to see them. Experimentation is the key to really getting a feel for long exposure photography, because there's quite a number of variables that are hard to gauge. How long you need to expose for, whether you can manage your aperture and ISO settings to get a good exposure value, and how fast your subject is moving and how much blur you want. So it's really important to practice a lot and have fun while you're doing it. Lesson 29, practical exercise, long exposure photography. In this exercise, you'll learn more about having fun using slow shutter speeds, making long exposures and being creative with them. Set your camera to shutter priority or to manual mode and choose a dark place, so either somewhere at night or indoors. And this exercise could take some time to complete depending on how little light that there is and how long you make your exposures. You can experiment with any type of subject that's moving, so long as there's at least a little bit of movement. Even the surface of a pond that's barely moving can make some interesting photos. Or if you've got a fairly dark night and there's movement in the clouds, this can also be interesting. The key thing to remember is the slower your subject's moving, the longer exposure time you'll need to be able to capture the essence of that movement. Some subjects you could try could be people walking in the street or traffic moving along the road at night, or a pond, a waterfall, a stream, the movement of the ocean on the seaside, or even trees blowing in the breeze. Start with your camera on your tripod and making an interesting composition. Focus on your subject and then switch your camera or on your lens to manual mode, so it's not going to try and refocus each time you push the shutter release button. Start this exercise using your slowest shutter speed, and remember, the wider you adjust your aperture and the higher you adjust your ISO, this is going to make your shutter speed faster. So you want to use a lower ISO and a narrower aperture to be able to keep your shutter speed slow. Experiment with different exposure times, and for some of them, if you can, use the bulb mode. So even if you have to use the bulb mode with your finger on the shutter, try and do this as gently and as steadily as possible so you don't move your camera. And of course, the better tripod, the more sturdy tripod you've got, the less risk you will have of camera movement. Each time you take a photo, and it might take a while, check the result on your monitor and zoom in to see if you're getting the blurring effect that you're after. This could be difficult to see even if you are zoomed in. And take plenty of photos and keep practicing. Learning to do long exposure photography is all about experimentation and making some good mistakes along the way. The main points in this lesson are: long exposure photography can be a lot of fun. Low light situations are the easiest when you're first experimenting with long exposures. A good tripod makes long exposure photography more manageable. Practice this to improve your photography. Experiment a lot with different subjects moving at different speeds and with your shutter speed settings.